the foods that we eat. If you imagine coffee, chocolate, berries, so many of our fruits, apples, apricots, all of these rely on insects.
Insects, they're tiny, easy to overlook, and most of the time unwelcome.
But without them, life on Earth as we know it could collapse.
Yes, so on the climate question from the BBC World Service, we're asking, how are insects being impacted by climate change? I'm Greer Jackson.
I'm Jordan Dunbar.
Let's meet our insect expert. In his spare time, he is a fire eater, a circus performer, and trains fleas to perform stunts. Yes, you did hear me correctly, Jordan. He's also a zoologist and a lecturer at the University of Falmouth in the UK. It's Dr. Tim Cockerell.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Really great to have you, Tim.
Tim, my favourite fact, though, apart from all of those, is that you have an insect species named after you. Is that Dr. Cockerell, or are they just Tim?
So it's built into the Latin name, into the scientific name of this insect. So it's Megaphragma cockerelli. So it's got the cockerel bit. So if a species is named after a person, you usually just put an I on the end. So it sounds really impressive, and I do like to talk about it, obviously.
It does sound really impressive. What did you do?
So I found it up a tree in Borneo, at the top of a rainforest canopy in Borneo. And I should say as well, although it does sound like a super impressive thing to have a species of animal named after you. If I say to an entomologist, I've got a species named after me, usually they say, oh, what, only one? Because there are lots of entomologists who have many, many, many species named after them. And of course, people like David Attenborough who have hundreds of species named after him. So yeah, I found it at the top of a tree, a rainforest canopy in northern Borneo. We climbed up all the way to the top, we extracted it from the canopy, and we discovered it as a new species. And it was described by a scientist in the Natural History Museum, Andrew Polacek, and it's only ever been seen by humans once. There is one single specimen in existence, and it lives on a tiny microscope slide, dissected in the Natural History Museum.
So it's really small. What does it look like?
And in fact, it's one of the smallest animals on planet Earth. It's about 0.5 millimetre long, or slightly less than that, about the size of a grain of sand. And so if it was flying around in this studio, if it landed on your hand, you probably wouldn't even notice that it's there.
How did you find it if it's so small?
Yeah. Well, we have various sampling techniques. And so this was used, a particular technique where we send a kind of a substance up into the canopy of the rainforest that knocks the insects down, and then we collect them in trays, and then we look at them under the microscope afterwards. And so a lot of the time you end up with a kind of insect soup, and you don't know what's there. So that you could spend a morning in the rainforest and you can collect enough specimens to spend the next 20 years analysing back in the museum. And so we look at it down the microscope and then realise it's something completely new to science. And then the laborious process begins of taxonomy. And so that's a specialist in that particular group of insects that have to check it against all of the other specimens of all of the other things in that family or in that genus in museums around the world. They have to borrow specimens, get it down the microscope until they're finally certain that it is a brand new thing.
Is it a fly? Is that the closest thing?
It looks like a fly. It's actually a kind of wasp. A parasitoid wasp. And so really interesting thing about wasps is that when you say wasp, most people imagine those big black and yellow things that annoy you at picnics. But the vast majority of wasps are very small things, and they have this life cycle called the parasitoid life cycle, whereby they lay their eggs inside another animal, usually another insect, and then the larvae of the wasp live inside that insect, kind of meals on wheels. So they get this source of live food, and then a caterpillar, for example, will be munching away merrily on a leaf, completely unaware of what's going on, and then rather than turning into a beautiful butterfly, it kind of explodes, and hundreds of tiny little parasitoid wasps emerge.
Is that where they got the idea for the alien franchise?
Exactly
from?
that. Yeah, it's a direct.
And you've discovered a new one.
Yeah,
and you're really happy.
Absolutely. But now that sounds like a weird thing, doesn't it? You know, the idea that there's this weird way of life, this kind of alien, literally from the Alien films, this alien way of being. That way of life is probably the normal way to be an animal on planet Earth. So there are probably more species of parasitoid wasp than there are of any other different kind of, certainly animal or complex living thing, right? So they're enormously diverse. You can add up all of the species of everything else on planet Earth, all of the other animals, all of the plants, all of the mammals, vertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, everything else. You add up all of that number of species, it still doesn't come close to the number of insect species that exist on planet Earth.
Spell out for us what it is they do for us, whether we are aware of it or not.
They've been around for an extremely long time. So the best part of half a billion years, 480 million years ago, is when insects first arose. And so they were around long before the dinosaurs, for example. Yeah. And so every ecosystem that anything that we see, if you look out the window, or you pick your favorite animal species, or even humans, they've evolved in the context of these ecosystems that are intrinsically kind of interwoven with insects as a big part of them. And so flowers wouldn't exist were it not for insects. So the vast majority of flowers are pollinated by insects, and a flower is just an advertisement to an insect to say, can you come and share my pollen around with some other plants for me, please, and I'll give you a reward. And so we get this co-evolution for the best part of half a billion years of insects with everything else. And so they are just intertwined with everything that we do. And of course, there is then that question, what do insects do for us? Because of course, as humans, we always kind of default to thinking about, what can nature provide for us? What can insects provide for us? And the answer is a huge amount. So the pollination services, for example, pollinating our crops, about 3/4 of the crop species that we consume around the world are pollinated, at least in part, by insects, right? And so that we can put a value on that. It's called an ecosystem service. Those things that we take from nature, the benefits that we gain from nature, that we can put a specific economic value on. And it's about $500 billion globally each year. That value of pollination. So it's pollination, it's pest control. Often people encourage beneficial insects in crops. In citrus, for example. So if you go into some citrus plantations, oranges and lemons and things like that in the tropics, people encourage nests of this species of ant called the weaver ant. They use their really fascinating things. They use their larvae a bit like a hot glue gun to glue leaves together to create this. So the larvae secrete silk. The adult ants use them like a glue stick, gluing these leaves together so they have these arboreal nests. And then by foraging out, they strip all of the pest species from the citrus plantations. So it's this great example of working with nature, basically. Rather than spraying pesticides all over the place, there are usually some kind of beneficial insects or other animals that can suppress pest populations.
Could we live without them then?
Absolutely not. No, I mean there's that just the pollination services alone. The foods that we eat. If you imagine coffee, chocolate, berries, so many of our fruits, apples, apricots, all of these rely on insects being pollinated, as well as those things that we eat. There are also the oils that we eat, a huge part of our diet. So if you go into a supermarket and look at a product on the shelf, some kind of vegetable oil will be pretty close to the top. One of the most important oils around the world is palm oil. Palm oil pollinated by a tiny little weevil that's been exported from the native range in Guinea and West Africa and now is all over the world. So the entire kind of world population of that incredibly important crop is used in biodiesel, in cosmetics, in most kind of processed foods that we would buy. It all relies on this one species of weevil, which is now around the world with all of these crops. So crucially important. So if that weevil disappeared, they'd have to go back to the old-fashioned way of doing it when they first started to grow oil palm around the world, which is to go around with a tiny paintbrush and tickle the flowers to transfer the pollen manually. And so you imagine that service. It'd take literally millions of people probably to go around and do that. Again, service provided by insects.
How are insects being impacted by climate change?
So it's a really interesting question. There are some really key examples that have been studied about specific examples of insects that are responding in various ways to climate change. Broadly speaking, though, because insects are so diverse and because ecosystems are so complex, the short answer is we don't know exactly. We've got some kind of inklings, but it's always going to be that answer when it comes to studying any kind of ecosystem, is that it's complicated and we're working on it, but we don't know exactly. And so when it comes to climate change, there are broad trends, and there is a decline in insect species diversity, a slight decline, and certainly in insect abundance. So it's those two things we think about when we're studying biodiversity: is abundance and species richness, the diversity of things, and then the sheer kind of physical volume of things that exist. And so there have been some studies that are showing a decline in insect abundance and some small decline in insect diversity, just kind of globally as those broad trends. But again, it's very difficult to tease out literally the climate question, right? To tease out the effects of climate, because we're in a situation where insects are facing threats from all sorts of different angles, right? in a way, the good thing in terms of studying ecosystems and environments is that insects are the canaries in the coal mine, right? So if an ecosystem is being affected, it will be shown in what is going on in the insects.
Why?
Because they're an intrinsic part of most ecosystems on planet Earth, and so if something is going wrong, well, the insects will be showing it. They're so diverse, so there are lots of species. You can study them relatively easily, but again, with that proviso that an ecosystem is a very, very complex thing. So we have some of those broad trends, but then insects are also facing habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, increased use of pesticides, and then some other things that we wouldn't necessarily think about. Of course, urbanization. But let's say that you build a road through the middle of a forest, then rather than a big patch of forest, you've got two smaller patches of forest, and they behave very differently. Smaller patches of forest can't support as many animals, but then of course you've got the physical disturbance, and then you've got the street lights, and insects react. We've all seen the idea of a moth to a flame. We've all seen insects flying against the window at night or coming to the light bulb. And so light pollution, for example, is a massive issue as we become increasingly urbanized. And so insects are being faced by all of these issues left, right and center. And so teasing out the broad climate impact is actually very difficult. There are specific examples, though, really specific examples.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking down as to what you've got hidden under the table, Tim.
Well, I've got several things, yeah. So let's bring out this one first. So this is now I'm going to use the word cockroach.
Right.
Right. When I say cockroach, now this is in this container. It's I've just kept it in this container temporarily so that we don't infest the studio with cockroaches, and it's perfectly happy and healthy in there. And I'll put it back in its natural habitat in a second. When I say the word cockroach, so there are about 4,500 species of cockroach around the world. Only a handful of them are pest species, right? So most of them are very gentle, benign creatures that are involved in decomposition in ecosystems, right? So they decompose rotting wood. They live in caves and feed on the guano from bats and things like that. This is a species of insect that was discovered about 10, 15 years ago in a cave in Guinea in West Africa, in the entrance to a cave. And it's thought now that this is extinct in the wild.
So it's only in captivity?
Yeah, and it's kept reasonably widely. It's adapted quite well to captivity, and it's bred by kind of hobbyist insect keepers around the world. But it's very likely that this is now completely extinct in the wild. Yeah, of course.
And do we know why they've gone extinct in the wild?
It's mining. And I brought that in as an example, so their habitat is being significantly affected by mining. Because insects are so intrinsically linked to ecosystems, they have a particular set of requirements. What do they feed on? What are the other species that they interact with? What's the temperature window that they live in? What's the humidity window? And so lots and lots of species are vulnerable to being kind of wiped out completely by, of course, those human impacts like mining, but to other things as well. And the climate problem, climate change, is a really significant one if you are an insect or another animal with very specific requirements.
So as the temperature goes up, if that's outside your requirements, you're not going to survive.
Exactly. And that's some of the effects that have been studied of climate change on insects are with some species of butterflies, some species of dragonflies in the northern hemisphere. Of course, the further north we go, the colder it gets generally. And so insects have evolved to fit that particular window. There's a kind of band right across the world that is the limits, the temperature limits that they are comfortable to live in and to breed in. And as the climate has changed, well, they are moving northwards. And so we've seen that. It's been studied in various species that the entire range is shifting northwards as the temperature increases. So they're moving into the
mosquitoes.
Well, mosquitoes are certainly one. So the other issue that can cause, and this is why it can be an issue, is as well as moving northwards, so towards the poles as the temperature increases, imagine that your comfortable window that you've evolved in is halfway up a mountain. Right, so you get further towards the top of the mountain, it gets cooler. Further towards the bottom of the mountain, generally it gets warmer. So as average temperatures increase, well, your comfortable window starts getting higher and higher and higher. So you think, okay, well, that's fine. But there's only so much space at the top of the mountain. Mountains tend to be quite pointy at the top. And so lots of insects are getting higher and higher. And eventually their window that they're able to survive in will just disappear off the top of a mountain.
What's the problem? Explain why it's so important that something like this cockroach doesn't go extinct, what happens when you take them out of the ecosystem?
Some species are ecosystem engineers. So an example in North America, there's a species, the blue orchard bee, which pollinates apricots. As climate change has caused temperatures to rise on average, the apricots flower earlier, right? So we see this all around temperate zones, particularly in northern hemispheres. Spring is arriving earlier. Springtime is warmer, but the effects are disproportionate. So the effects on the apricot trees are kind of sped up, and then the effects on the bees are sped up, but not quite as much. And they overwinter in these nest holes deep within the earth, which means that as the apricots flower earlier, they flower and then the flowers have gone, and then the bees kind of wake up,
So
and
there's
then
a
the bees come out.
mismatch.
Yeah, so it's there's a phenological mismatch, a mismatch in timing, and so again, it's really, really complicated. It's not just a case that okay, temperatures increase, everything gets a bit faster or moves a little bit further north, and so the bees now are starting to emerge after their main food source has been and gone, and then of course we have the problem that the crops are not being pollinated quite as well.
We mentioned mosquitoes. If their window moves up and they bring things like malaria, they're coming to areas that aren't used to it because they didn't have malaria for however many years.
Exactly.
That's moving.
Yeah, and so this is another thing that has been studied. So I think there's an example in Ethiopia, in Colombia, whereby populations, upland populations, up on the side of a hill or a mountain, that may have been built there, and these populations that have been established because they're above the kind of mosquito zone. They're above that temperature range of mosquitoes, and now they're being engulfed by mosquitoes and malaria and dengue fever. One of the more extreme climate predictions is predicting that London may even have dengue fever by 2060.
Because of the rise in temperatures.
Exactly, yeah. So dengue fever, it's a virus, mosquito-borne virus, and we see it as a tropical, subtropical disease. And so we've kind of got to prepare for the situation that some of these tropical diseases may well be coming our way for people in the UK, for example.
So would you say that some species are, I'm putting this in inverted commas, benefiting from climate change in that they've got range expansions? If there's perhaps more rain, then that's more breeding grounds for mosquitoes, for instance. But how does that compare to the overall trend? Is it enough to sort of offset the damage?
So probably not. And another example with mosquitoes, actually, one of the ways that they are benefiting, and that it's not just that kind of simple idea as okay, temperatures just get warmer on average, and so things kind of move around. In Pakistan in 2022, where there were the devastating floods, they were left with lots and lots of standing water. Okay, so we've got increased temperature, so insects can breed more quickly. You can squeeze more generations of insects into a particular length of time. The microorganism that causes malaria can reproduce more quickly, but then those extreme weather events that we're seeing more often because of climate change are causing those impacts. Like, for example, in Pakistan after the floods, there was a big explosion of malaria. More malaria than there should have been compared to previous records in that year, because there were just lots and lots of breeding grounds with all of that standing water that was left from the floods.
And you mentioned with Pakistan, because it was warmer and there was more water, the mosquitoes were able to breed faster. And that got me wondering, if insects breed quite quickly anyway, don't they? And they can breed even faster. Does that mean they can sort of evolve and adapt to some of these changes?
Yeah, so it's one of the reasons why insects are so successful. If you're an elephant trying to respond to some kind of evolutionary problem, it's a relatively long period of time before that you get the next generation and the next generation that can kind of be selected for those things that kind of respond to that. Whereas if you're a fruit fly, well, then you can do that in a few times in a month even. But climate change is still outstripping insects' ability, broadly speaking, to solve these problems. And so the other way of looking at that is that if climate change is causing problems for insects, imagine what it's doing for an elephant or for an oak tree that has that generational time, which is much, much longer.
The climate is changing faster than even insects, who are the fastest evolving of all of us.
Absolutely, yeah.
You mentioned that the insects are like canaries in a coal mine, i.e. they're like an early warning system. What would we start to see if temperatures are rising and those ecosystems are being really affected? Is it things like food security? What would start to happen that we would realise, okay, there is a big problem?
Yeah, certainly. And so it comes back to all of those ecosystem services that we rely on, that insects provide. And so there is, the big one is pollination. And so massive, massive implications for human food security, for example. But also there are other ecosystem services, like decomposition is a really, really big one. Where there are cattle, there are also dung beetles and dung flies. And so they provide a massive massive service of just clearing up the dung, for example. You know, we would literally be up to our necks in it if it were not for all of those insects that were decomposing. But when a tree falls down, you know, for nutrients to return to the forest, it's cockroaches, it's termites, they're such an important thing. So we will start to see more and more issues with those ecosystem services, those things that we derive some kind of economic benefit from. But we are just going to have to respond, you know. So as climate change pushes ranges of things northwards, well, then we're going to start to rethink what kind of crops we can grow and how we can rely on pollinators that perhaps were a few hundred miles further south 20 years ago or something like that.
Tim, this is an area where environmental and climate solutions come together to try and keep those global temperatures down. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which we talk a lot about, different solutions. But what are some of the unique ones that people can do and countries can do for insects?
So I always think about on that kind of ultimate level, if you open your back door, if you're lucky to have a garden, you can do very simple things like making your garden more friendly to insects. And so making your gardens wildlife friendly, you know, not putting plastic grass down, just planting native species, making sure that there's a range of flowering plants that can flower throughout the year to sustain those pollinators. So there are those individual things, and even just kind of planting some flowers. If you've got a balcony, you know, planting some flowers on a balcony to encourage or to help sustain those pollinating insects can be a really important thing. But then there are also those other things that we can do in the way that we consume that have direct impacts on insects. And so if you can afford to buy organic food that hasn't been treated with pesticides, for example, you know, lots of pesticides we now know are persistent in the environment. So they're sprayed on a crop and then they're eaten by by bees, for example, in small amounts, and then they kind of accumulate up the food chain. And so if we can work to eliminate pesticides from the environment, well, it can have a beneficial effect overall. So there are those individual things that you can do in the face of these kind of broad global issues.
And I can see this cockroach isn't the only specimen that you've brought into studio with you.
No, so I have these things here, these are beetles called jewel scarabs. And they're absolutely stunning, really, really amazing things.
They look like they've been spray painted.
They do.
They're so metallic.
I always think they look like polished metal. And so they're a scarab beetle. Many people have heard of the idea of scarab beetles that were revered in ancient Egypt's dung beetles. And so this is another member of that broad family. And these live in cloud forests in Central America, in Costa Rica, for example. And it's thought that they've evolved this beautiful metallic, like polished metal kind of look to their entire body as a way of camouflage. So if you live in a very moist environment, if you live literally up in the clouds, you're surrounded by droplets of moisture, and so you're living in amongst leaves, and so if you have a kind of silvery surface on your body, well, then you can reflect the leaves and perhaps you look like a little droplet of water, and so avoid being eaten by predators. And seeing these in the wild, you know, it's one of those incredible moving experiences to see the results of a few 100 million years of evolution. But these beetles are facing the challenge that their habitat is just disappearing before our very eyes. So they are very much in danger. So there's this astonishing diversity, but it needs to be protected.
Tim, thank you so much for coming in and bringing your friends along with you as well. It's the most exciting thing we've had in the studio.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Good, no problem. No, it's been great to chat.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel so you don't miss a thing.
And if you have a climate question, you can comment it below and we'll answer it in a future show. I'm Greer Jackson.
I'm Jordan Dunbar. See you next time.